Welcome to the library. Two important items. Turn off your cell phones, please. And this is being videotaped. It will be on the library YouTube channel next week. So if you want to share this with people, we'd really appreciate it. But without further ado, welcome and thank you for coming tonight. Skokie rocks. It's a full house, and I'm thrilled. We are so pleased to see everyone. My name is Rachel Rosenberg, and I have lived in Skokie for over 30 years. I am a member of the Skokie Beautification and Improvement Commission, which is a co-sponsor of the event tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let everyone know that the Commission has a program that we manage and coordinate called the Beautification Awards, which is a program that looks at the front yards in Skokie. And what are we looking for? The criteria is on the Commission website. And a few years ago, we updated the judging criteria and added some new categories so that native plants are elevated in that criteria. The website has the information, and our commission will start evaluating the front yards. And yes, you can nominate yourself, so don't be shy, the first week of June. We encourage everyone to add native plants to their front yard, and in the application, point out what you have so that our judges, when they come by your houses, they could take a look for those items. I'm honored to introduce one of my colleagues at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Becky Barak is a conservation scientist and seed bank curator at the garden and an adjunct professor at Northwestern University in the program in plant biology and conservation. She studies seed biology and biodiversity in tall grass prairies and decision-making for restoration, particularly seed mix design. Becky works with collaborators to apply these biodiversity questions to studying lawn alternative plantings through the Rethinking Lawns project. The students in her lab study a variety of topics related to conservation and restoration in the Chicago area. Becky has a master's and a PhD in plant biology and conservation from Northwestern University and the Chicago Botanic Garden. Becky lives in Skokie. Yay! With her husband, Yuval, 2 kids who are here tonight, cats, a dog, a lizard, and of course, many plants. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I wanted to start by saying thank you. First of all, thank you to the Skokie Library for having me, and to the Skokie Beautification and Improvement Commission, and to Rachel, who first invited me. I live in Skokie. Many of my family members live in Skokie or have lived in Skokie. And so being invited to speak at the Skokie Library makes me feel like I have really arrived as a person on the scene. So thank you for being here. I hope you take something from this talk that you deem worthwhile in your life. I would also like to thank all of the funders of my research and this project. Walder Foundation, which is in Skokie, actually we got the Biota Award from them, which helped to expand our project. And then we recently have been funded by the National Science Foundation, which we really hope we're going to be able to keep that grant, and the Paul G. Allen Foundation. So thank you to them. Special thanks to my collaborator, Liz Anna Kozik, for all of the illustrations here. She has made an illustrated guide to lawn alternatives, which I wrote draft on because she would say that it's still a work in progress, and she's really still refining it. But you can get it on our website, and I do have some copies of it here today. And so Liz is an incredible artist and historian and a naturalist and a science communicator, and you should definitely follow her work on social media if you can. And then thank you to the rest of my collaborators, the amazing students that work on this project, and everybody who has supported this work. So let's start by talking about lawns. Lawns can be considered the perfect green carpet, And I like to tell this story that I wanted to find a picture of the perfect green lawn and kind of how to maintain that lawn. And so I went to the This Old House website because I figured, like, they're going to tell me straight about lawns and how to keep them beautiful and how to keep them green and what you need to do. So I'll come back to that, but this is a photo from the This Old House website. So lawn has some problems, which you may already be thinking about if you're here at this talk. Among them, mowing takes a huge amount of gas, and gas mowers are really inefficient, so they put a lot of carbon dioxide into the air relative to how long they're on for and everything like that. Keeping lawns green takes a tremendous amount of water. 30 to 60% of potable water in cities can go to keeping lawns green. Not to mention all of the herbicides that go into keeping them pristine with no other plants growing in them. Let's get back to This Old House. So when I went to that website, and I was excited because I was thinking I was going to learn about how much you need to water it, how much you need to mow it to have the perfect grass lawn, I actually found even on the This Old House website, they are thinking about lawn alternatives. And that is what made me think that this idea is not so niche or niche. It's everywhere. And I think every once in a while, you'll see an article in a magazine about people that have converted their lawns. And so, anyways, I think that idea is out there. I don't think anything that I'm saying is too fringe or too weird. Okay. Lest you think that I think that we shouldn't have any lawns at all, I always like to start by saying that lawns play important roles in cities and villages for recreation, for sports, professional and home, for picnics. Nobody wants you to play soccer on a sedge meadow. You could definitely break your ankle if you did that. So let me just start by saying that I don't think all lawns need to be converted into something else. Some of them serve a purpose, and turf grass lawns are actually really good at what they do for playing soccer on and things like that. But lawns aren't always used for recreation. Sometimes they're just there. They don't need to be. Nobody's playing soccer here alongside Lakeshore Drive. The mowers, in fact, it's really dangerous to mow alongside Lakeshore Drive. They have to go around all of these trees. There's probably a better way to do this. And in your home landscape, there may also be spaces that you use more and spaces that you use less. And so actually, it's awesome that Rachel talked about the awards. I've tried to sprinkle some photos from the Skokie Beautification Awards into my talk. And I will tell you a little bit even more about the awards criteria. Hopefully you can read them. But you can see that it talks about plant diversity, native plants, and then reducing turf. And you'll see some of these pictures from our neighbors with a little trophy on it and that they won the beautification award. But so in this case, perhaps the people that live in this home, they don't really use their front yard maybe for recreation, and so they thought this could be a great opportunity for planting some native plants. Maybe they will support pollinators. Maybe they'll serve other important functions. And so when we think about those functions, when we think about lawns, we think about ecosystem services, which I will talk about in a second, but existing lawns are an opportunity. So some people say that lawns are just a green parking lot. They're the same as asphalt. But they're actually not. I think they represent an opportunity because there are plants growing there, there's soil, there's some water getting there. So this is an opportunity to maybe convert it or enhance it into something a little bit different that can support species and ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, to put simply, are the benefits that we receive from nature. This is an example. This is our hypothesized relationships. You'll see another graph like this. But this is just showing if you go all the way from a literal parking lot to AstroTurf to maybe some lawns that are less maintained, all the way through to a natural area like a prairie, we think that the ecosystem services will increase as these habitats become more diverse, have more native plants, things like that. So, to talk about native plants, and this is Spring Beauty just this past week from Harm's Woods, which wouldn't that look really pretty if it was growing in your lawn, the little pink flowers? I think so. Native plants, and this is the definition from the Conservation Foundation, native plants evolved or adapted to our local environment for thousands of years and are an important part of our local habitats, ecosystems, and ecosystem services like pollination, infiltration, carbon sequestration. Very convenient because those are ecosystem services that we're also studying in our research project. They are the most sustainable plants for our specific area. So we can look towards native habitats, such as the prairie, that existed in our area. Some remnants still exist. And so we can sort of look to those habitats as inspiration for bringing native plants into our landscapes at home. So here's another example of a Garden Award winner where you are really getting a diversity that you may find in a prairie restoration with differences in height, differences in plant species, and kind of a wide range of species that you don't always see in a front yard. We can look towards where these plants grow in their native habitats for inspiration of how we may bring them into our home gardens. So as an example, wild geranium is a woodland understory plant. It grows on the ground in woods, so it's really used to being shaded. So that could be a good plant to think about when we're thinking about shaded areas of our home landscapes. Bottle gentian, on the other hand, is a autumn blooming prairie plant, which can exist in full sun. So we can think about where these plants exist in nature, and we can kind of use that to inspire where we might put them at home. I wanted to show an example from the Chicago Botanic Garden. So this is McDonald Woods at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and on the ground there are Virginia bluebells, which are kind of just starting to bloom. They're a spring ephemeral woodland plant. I have seen them in home gardens in Skokie too. And these are some examples of how they're used in more manicured gardens at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Okay, so native plants are used to being in our habitats. We can learn about how we might want to use them at home. And we can think about the benefits of native plants. Raise your hand if you've seen this figure before. This is a pretty famous illustration to show that native plants are known for their long roots, but you may not know that this plant right here, that's turf grass, that's Kentucky bluegrass, which is most commonly used in turf grasses in our area. And you can see that it has little tiny roots, which you know if you've ever put down sod, the roots don't go very deep. On the other hand, if you look at some prairie plants, they can grow tens or more feet of root underground. And so when we think about these roots, we can think about being able to access water from much deeper in the soil, so these plants can survive longer without being watered. Unlike our Kentucky bluegrass with the little tiny dinky roots that people have to water very frequently over the hot summer days. We think about carbon sequestration in those deep roots, and we also think about stormwater infiltration. So having those deep roots can help habitats that have native plants in them absorb a lot more stormwater. And so maybe you have had the experience of seeing a turf grass lawn that was flooded. There's plants there. It's weird that it's flooded, right? But the roots are so short that sometimes that water cannot go down into the soil. And so having these deep roots can help bring stormwater down into the deeper layers of the soil. This is an illustration by Liz, just to show Kentucky bluegrass again. The shallow root system, and the shallow root system is sort of bad coming and going because it needs to be watered constantly and it doesn't absorb enough water in times of flooding. So this thing about the roots and the deep roots of the native plants is something we think about a lot in our project. This is an example of, Liz made this too, that these plants right here are examples of weeds that have been growing in a school lawn for potentially 20 years versus some second-year plugs of native plants and just how dense and deep those roots are before they've even been planted in the ground. They're just in little pots. So again, we think our landscape choices that we make can be important for thinking about ecosystem services like water infiltration, pollinators, urban cooling, and carbon storage. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in the next section on the research project that I'm working on, which is called the Rethinking Lawns Project. So this is a map of some of our sites. We test lawns and lawn alternative plantings across several public green spaces in Chicago. I work at the Chicago Botanic Garden, so most of my pictures are going to come from there. But this is an example of our experimental plots at the Chicago Botanic Garden. You can see these if you come to the garden, but you have to walk to the more south end of the garden, like closer to Dundee Road. And so if you can see this map, we have 8 different lawn alternative treatments that we're trialing in these gardens. We also have experimental sites and also sort of case study sites in the Chicago Park District. This is an example at Horner Park. And we have signage at all of those places to kind of talk about the research and what we're working on. So these are some examples of the things that we're looking at: native biodiversity, soil carbon storage, and stormwater infiltration. Here are some students, so this project would not work without the amazing students that we have, and they're gonna also pop up during this presentation. Here's some students doing pollinator observations at the prairie treatment of the lawn alternatives plots at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And you may notice that the prairie treatment's really tall compared to everything else, and that is by design. We really tried to keep the rest of our treatments short and manageable for something that may be more likely to be used in a residential setting or in a place where you just can't put a lot of tall plants because visibility is important or because perceptions of safety. So we're looking at the pollinators, we're looking at the plants, and we're looking at water infiltration. And so this is a question of like, how much stormwater could these different types of plantings absorb? And to do that, you use this thing that looks like a pogo stick, and it is basically a fancy version of a tin can that has 2 rings on it, and you pour water in that ring, and you time how long it takes for the water to drain out. That's it. But we're trying to look for treatments that can drain quickly, so get more of that water down in a big storm event, get more water down into the soil as opposed to going across the soil and bringing all sorts of chemicals and with it into our waterways. Here's another picture of students conducting that work. And then this is Brian Lovejoy. He's one of the students in my lab, and he is doing a greenhouse experiment to look at different native grasses and how much water the different types of roots can absorb. So another ecosystem service that we're looking at is urban cooling. And this is some work from a group in New York, but they also have some data from Chicago. And so they have found that compared to lawn, which is here, grasslands can actually be 2 degrees cooler than a lawn. And so, again, increasing the diversity, increasing the types of native plants that are present can help with urban heat islands effects that makes urban areas hotter in the summer. And so we are measuring that by these kind of weather station things. These just went up last week to test temperature and humidity at the level of plants and then at the level of kind of where people would be in these different types of plantings. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different types of lawn alternatives that we are testing, and I think that different types of these can also be used in home landscapes. So when someone asks, like, what is the alternative to lawn? Well, it turns out there are many proposed alternatives, and we like to think of them as a menu of options. So we're not going to say everyone should do this one thing, but recognizing that people have different goals, people have different budgets, and there's a lot of different ways to potentially incorporate these ideas into different landscapes. So there's a whole range, and that can range from, this, you may not be able to read this, but it says, resilience, thy name is goutweed. And goutweed is a really bad invasive plant. We actually had it in Skokie at the house I used to live in. We tried really hard and almost eradicated it, I think. But it's a really bad invasive species, and it can be marketed as a resilient ground cover. But that's not the kind of thing that I would recommend replacing your turf grass with, because I think that's way worse than turf grass. All the way to movements that encourage people to convert their whole lawn to legumes or to wildflowers to support pollinators. And so this range of possible lawn alternatives can vary in a lot of things, but the way I think about them is that they can differ in their nativeness, so whether or not they contain species that are native or non-native to the Midwestern US, and their diversity, so how many species are included and how similar or different are those species to one another. And they can also differ in how similar or different they are to a typical turfgrass lawn. So there are some opportunities, I will tell you about them, where you can basically have a turfgrass lawn look by just making small switches in what species you are planting, all the way to being inspired for like a full restoration. And so our research project explores this variety of treatments and their ecosystem services. We are conducting this as, or I already said this, but we think that different types of lawn alternatives can fill different goals and that there isn't necessarily one right answer, but we do hypothesize that the more native plants and the greater diversity are used in these plantings, the greater we would have for ecosystem services like pollinator support, water infiltration, and all of those things. So here are some examples of some of the things that we are testing. And these are the plots at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Again, this may be hard to read, but there's a clover planting in the back. And then there's the turfgrass lawn control. That's just the lawn that was there before we started this experiment. And then a fine fescue lawn, which is kind of the first thing I'm going to talk about. So fine fescues is called a lot of things, but it is a mix of species of fine fescues. I think there's 5 different species of fescues, and different mixes of these types of fine fescue mixes include different numbers of species and different cultivars and whatever. But the idea is that fine fescues grow slowly. So they don't require as much watering as our typical lawns do because they don't grow very fast. And they don't require as much mowing because they don't grow as fast. So they also stop growing at a shorter height than our like regular Kentucky bluegrass would grow. So it looks a lot like regular grass. It looks a lot like a regular lawn, but it has deeper, denser roots. And we know from our research in the greenhouse, at least, in the greenhouse and in the field, that there's more water infiltration in the fine fescue than there is in the typical lawns of Kentucky bluegrass. We know that there's less soil erosion. So this is a really easy switch because this is something that looks a lot like regular lawn. And so I will get to this later when I open up to you about what my actual lawn looks like. But when I have like holes in my lawn, I just overseed it with this stuff. It's called EcoGrass. I buy it from Prairie Moon Nursery, but you can get it in a lot of different places. It's just called fine fescue. And so you can just start, if you have holes like patches, you can start there and gradually kind of convert your lawn into this thing that's not going to look very different, but that is going to hopefully require less watering and less mowing than whatever lawn you may currently have. This is just a figure. This is from Allison Brance's thesis, that's her. And she did her master's on a greenhouse experiment looking at different grasses and how much mass they grew above ground in their shoots and in their roots below ground. And so she found that per lawn, like a little lawn pot, the EcoGrass actually had built up the most above ground and below ground mass, and even beat out some of the native species, but the native species are just more slower growing, but ultimately will be bigger in the long run. So that's EcoGrass or fine fescues, same thing. It has a lot of marketing names, just so you know. It can be called Lomo Nomo fescue or EcoGrass, which is what I call it. Then there's clover. So clover is a thing that is kind of popular on the internet with people seeding clover directly into their lawns. And so the idea is that if you put clover in your lawn, clover is a legume. It's also non-native. So EcoGrass is not native, clover is not native. But they do potentially provide ecosystem services above kind of the typical lawns that we're thinking about. So the idea with clover is that it can actually fix nitrogen. So it's a legume. It can take nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil, which reduces the need for fertilizer. It also makes the overall lawn look shorter, and it supports pollinators, which it does. Some people don't like it because they don't want to have pollinator plantings interspersed throughout their whole lawn. But one of the things we're thinking about that will come up later is, are there native plants that you can just seed directly into your lawn, just like you could do for white clover? The other thing is that clover dies back a lot during the winter, so it kind of needs to be reseeded. Okay, then we can think about native plants. So we would look towards our native plants in the prairies and in the woodlands of our area, but just kind of pick the short ones that may work in home landscapes. So this is one of our sites also. It's at Uptown Coastal Natural Area, which is across from Weiss Hospital. If you ever go there, we have a field site there and experimental planting. And so here we're testing a bunch of native grasses and sedges. And then we also have a mixture which has a sedge, a grass, and a rush. But I'm going to tell you what those things are. But so this is 3 different species kind of all planted together to give a little bit of a mosaic look and potentially have different, like add a little more diversity. But these are all grass-like plants. We don't have any wildflowers yet in this treatment. And so this is a little figure called when is a grass not a grass? Well, I will also say, if you learn one thing in this talk, I'm going to tell you it. It's that when you think about grass, you may have been like, wow, I didn't know there were so many different types of grass. There are 11,000 species of grass in the world. So we don't have all of them in Illinois, but there are a lot of grasses. There are also other plants that you may think look like grass, but they're not grass, and they're called sedges and rushes, and you may have heard a rhyme. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes all the way down. But they all kind of look like grass, but they're slightly different, and they come from different plant families, even though they all look like grass. And we do have plant families, similar to how there's animal families. But anyways, sedges, I think are very cool. There's 500 native species of sedges in North America. There's about 200 that are native in Illinois, and there's a wide variety of different species of sedges. They're native plants and they're pretty. So to kind of break this down, this is our sedge lawn treatment at the Chicago Botanic Garden. It's made of a sedge, Pennsylvania sedge. This is a species that's really highly recommended a lot for lawn alternatives because it looks a lot like grass, especially if it's clumped together. Then we have purple love grass, which is a grass. It's a short grass. It kind of creates a plume of purple flowers and seeds, and if you didn't like that, you could mow it off if you wanted to, but that's a native grass. And then path rush, which is a rush. It's a very, very hardy plant. It's called path rush because it's actually used in paths, and you can step on it. This is Jackson Park. This has one of the older sedge lawns that we know about in the area. It's about 8 years old. And this is because when there was a historic, I'm going to forget this person's name, but a landscape architect, somebody knows it, because I always think it's Edward James Olmos, but it's not. Olmsted, that's it. Sorry to the landscape design fans out there. I am just an ecologist. But they redid Jackson Park with this Olmsted design, but they wanted to use only native plants. And Olmsted was really big on having expansive lawns. And so they had this idea of maybe we can use Pennsylvania sedge, which is a really short native plant, and kind of still get the look of an expansive lawn, but it's made with native plants. And so that's an idea that we've kind of incorporated from Chicago Park District. Here's another picture of that sedge lawn. And then the last thing that we have, we call them mini meadows. They are mixtures of short native grasses and short wildflowers. So here are some examples of some of the species that are in there. Short is maybe a relative term. Some of these wildflowers are really short and close to the ground. Others are more like a foot and a half. So you wouldn't necessarily have them in your lawn, but they could be around edges of lawns. Here's 3 examples of some short wildflowers that we use in our treatments. Jacob's Ladder, Prairie Violet, and Prairie Smoke. These are all blooming now or close to now. It is true that a lot of the native species, a lot of the short native flowers that we have in Illinois are spring bloomers, because if they come from the prairie, they kind of have an opportunity to bloom short before all the really tall grasses start growing and shading them out. So a lot of the short plants that we have do tend to be spring bloomers, but some of them are spring bloomers that have vegetation that hangs out and looks pretty for the rest of the season, even if the flowers are no longer there. And the reason I'm pointing these out is because it is often decried that we don't have enough spring blooming species to support pollinators in the early season before kind of all of the midsummer stuff blooms. And so it's often about leaving dandelions to bloom to support the pollinators, but there are also native plants that we can be adding to the landscape that can help support pollinators at that time. Okay, so the theme there is that there's a lot of different ways to rethink lawns. So we've talked about this a little bit kind of throughout, but here are some of my thoughts on how to incorporate lawn alternatives and native plants into your own life. Again, I do want you to remember that there's 11,000 plus species of grass, but another thing to remember is to start small and be patient. I'm going to tell you a cautionary tale, and the cautionary tale is you should not go home tomorrow and kill your lawn without a plan. If you kill your lawn without a plan, it's going to be weed dominated in no time because there are weed seeds in your soil and they are just waiting for that opportunity. And so the cautionary tale is that this person in Long Island, I've never met them. This is not my fault. I can't take credit for it. But he heard me on a podcast and he sent me an email and said, I heard you on this podcast. And my daughter and I really wanted to convert our lawn, and it's an acre, and we killed all of it, and then we put out yarrow seeds, and now it's all weeds, and my neighbors hate me. And so I was like, here's some things that I would try maybe, but really the thing is, don't kill an acre of lawn like out of nowhere. Like you really need to have a plan, and you really need to start small with the kinds of things that you're trying to do. So as an example, one thing you can do, this is not on the slide, is become what we might call a lazy lawnmower. So you don't have to mow as much, you don't have to water as much, you can feel comfortable about having some violets, which the violets in your lawn are actually native violets, but you can feel comfortable having some common violets in your lawn. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. But you can also think about planting out small sections. So you may plant a little bit near a path or near a home, and then expand that out with each season that comes along as you kind of see what works and what doesn't for your home. You could plant just a border alongside a sidewalk or a path in your home, and you could incorporate some of these native plants that we're thinking about. And so you're kind of slowly chipping away at your lawn without killing it all and just like putting some seeds out and hoping for the best. This is going to sound like the opposite of what I just said, but I also think experimenting is okay, and it's okay to kind of, put some things out and know that if it doesn't work out, you can always put sod down on that space. There's a way of kind of dialing it back, but that's kind of the reason of starting small. The second thing, so start small, be patient. The second thing is be patient. And so you may think about what types of things do you want to plant. Do you want to plant seeds? Do you want to plant plugs? Do you want to plant pots? Seeds are much less expensive, but they take time in order to look good. Plugs can start growing right away, but even with plugs, it kind of takes time for a plant to grow into its whole self. And I like to say that I think in the first year, if you're going to plant plugs or seeds really, but the first year is basically just for keeping them alive. So usually for native plants, I say they have to be watered for like 3 weeks, and then they really don't require a lot of water. They can be watered if it's really hot over the summer. But the goal in the first year is not necessarily to get them to flower or not necessarily to get them to look pretty. It's to get them to just stay alive and build the root system, because they're perennials, and so they need that root system in order to come back the next year. So if it doesn't look good the first year, you can just know that all the exciting stuff is happening underground and those roots are being built. So here's an example of our plots at Chicago Botanic Garden when we first installed them in 2022, and then what they looked like last summer. So, it took some time, but it does happen. And I will say, I think this comes up later, but what we did in order to get these plants in is we did kill the lawn with herbicides, and we can talk about that if people want to talk about it. But we killed them with herbicides, and we planted the plugs directly into the dead lawn. So again, it doesn't look that cute, but the dead lawn helps keep weeds out and kind of helps prevent erosion of the soil while those small native plants are starting to grow. Where can you get native plants? Great question. One place you can get them is at the Emily Oaks Native Plant Sales, which these are the dates that they are happening. And they grow the plants at Emily Oaks in the greenhouses. They sell them every year. I've gotten a lot of plants from here. You're supporting Skokie, and they're having an Earth Day celebration this Sunday with a native plant sale and then another one in May. Besides getting them from Emily Oaks, There are lists online of native plant sales. So the Illinois Native Plant Society and then West Cook Wild Ones are both websites you can go to look for what native plant sales are happening in the area. You can also go to larger native plant nurseries like Possibility Place, which is in Illinois, or Prairie Moon Nursery, which is in Minnesota. And it's in Minnesota, but they are a big player in the native plant industry, and they have a ton of information about native plants. So even if you're not going to buy plants from Prairie Moon Nursery, it can be a really good place to go for information about what's the difference between these native plants, like what am I looking for. Local nurseries can be hit or miss because you never know when you walk in if they're going to have native plants or not. But you may have seen these green little pots called Natural Garden Natives. They are put out by a company called Midwest Ground Covers, and those are native plants that were grown from within, I think, 90 miles of their site. And so if you see those at a nursery, you can know that those are actually native plants that come from our area. Again, know that for some native species, it can take a season or two before they flower. Okay, when you're thinking about, the way we call it in a restoration is species selection. I don't know if that's what people talk about when they talk about it for home gardening, but some things to think about are what types of soil do you have? What is the soil moisture? What kind of bloom period are you looking for? And so when people think about pollination, they like to think about having plants that are blooming throughout the season from early spring all the way to the fall. So you can think about, someone once described it to me as waves of bloom that are happening in the garden to kind of support pollinators. You can also think about bloom color, plant height, and then if you're using seeds, the germination requirements. So the seeds from our area typically require a cold stratification period, which means they need to be planted in the fall so that they can stay cold outside in the winter before they grow. Or you can also do the cold stratification in your refrigerator in damp sand and then put them out in the spring. So this is a screenshot from the Prairie Moon Cultural Guide. And if you just Google Prairie Moon Cultural Guide, they have lists of, I think, 700 native plants and all of this different information about the different plants. And you can find all of that info. I was told to tell you that the village code says that your grass should only be 6 inches tall. And in the parkway, if you have native plants, those should also be 6 inches, and they should not be planted all the way to the curb and the sidewalk. But, and these are 2 examples of native plants that are pretty short, especially prairie smoke. That's a really short one. Pussy toes is another one. Those are spring blooming plants that are really, really close to the ground, and I think could meet your 6-inch requirement. Another thing I think to think about is where are the leaves, the vegetation, and where's the flower? Because in some cases, you may have leaves that are kind of really close to the ground, and the flower may only be there for a week. It may be taller than 6 inches, but it may be kind of coming and going, and then what's really going to stay is the vegetation that's on the ground. Where can you get information about native plants? Well, Skokie has a fantastic website called Sustainable Gardening in Skokie. There's a lot of information about native plant design, about the garden awards, but just like a lot of information there about where to buy native plants. Kind of a lot of the things that I've already been talking about are covered on this website. I already said Prairie Moon Nursery. Pussy toes, this is a plant I think is really cute. It's because the flower looks like a little cat foot, but the leaves are also really close to the ground, and you can kind of use them to make paths or edges. And there's so much information about every single species on this Prairie Moon website. You can learn a lot about it before you commit to anything. I have a few things about implementation. We kind of already talked about this, but the pros and cons of seeds. Establishment from seed isn't very fast. So we're thinking about, if you have a lawn, could you just seed native plants into the lawn? So this is Libby Schaefer. She's here. Way to go, Libby. Libby is a PhD student in my lab, and she is studying whether you can plant native plants in lawns. She's planting 42 different species in the greenhouse this summer, so we can see which ones establish in lawn in the greenhouse and then try it out in the field. Like I said, we planted into dead grass. You can see I look really happy planting over there. One thing that we would say is not to till the soil, because in one of our sites we tilled and we just brought up so much weed seed that we were really dealing with it a lot in the subsequent years. So I think it's kind of like either getting rid of the lawn by killing it, doing some sod ripping, but not tilling the soil. And then for our plantings, to kind of try and get this effect, we plant the plugs really close to one another. So our sites, they range from 6 inches to 15 inches apart. If you really want to get a lawn-like planting, you kind of do have to plant them close. They do spread, but the plugs are small, and so we planted them pretty close together. Okay, some final garden design thoughts about incorporating native plants into your landscape. So the first one is called Cues to Care. Here are 2 more winners of the Skokie Garden Awards. And you can see in this case that you can really tell that these native plantings are deliberate. So these people have chosen to keep, both of them, have chosen to keep lawn in their front yard, but it's like neatly mowed around the edges of these native plants. So you don't think to yourself, wow, they just didn't do anything with their lawn, and that is what it turned into. It's very clear that they're using native plants as part of the landscape. And so Cues to Care is a thing that people talk about. Here's another example where you see that there's some, so it's in the parkway, but it's not right at the edge, so you can see that there's kind of some lawn around to show that the definition of this is the garden space and this is not. Cues to Care is a thing that people write scientific papers about, so it's a real thing. There's also another cue to care is some signage. So there are different conservation groups that will kind of give you the stamp of approval that you're providing pollinator habitat or conservation habitat, and that sign can also provide a cue to care. There is another thing, again, it's real. This is a scientific paper that's written about it. It's called the mullet theory, business in the front, party in the back, and the idea that you may want to have the front lawn looking super neat, but then in the back, grow 6-foot tall prairie plants and just like go nuts and stuff. So that's the mullet theory. And this paper, which I found, they actually interviewed people in Baltimore to see whether the mullet theory was true, and it was true. People had different things that they thought about when deciding what they were going to plant in their front yard versus in their backyard. The last little section that I have here is, do I practice what I preach? So I'm going to show you pictures of my yard, not the whole thing. So here are this is my lawn. You can see that there are violets and other potentially weedy things growing in there. So we do not really water. We watered a little bit in the fall because we have a dog now, and so like we were really trying to keep the grass alive, but never before having a dog have I ever really watered my lawn. We do not use herbicides, so there are other plants that are allowed to grow in the lawn. And we switched mowing to every other week rather than every week. And that there is some data to support mowing every other week can be helpful to pollinators and other insects. Lawn conversion, ? So there are, when we have open patches, we seed them with the ecograss or the fine fescue rather than Kentucky bluegrass, hoping that, over time we're gonna transition it more fully into the ecograss. Then I have short native plants in various sections with varying degrees of success currently. So here are some sedges. These pictures were all taken today because there's nothing like the last minute. And I was really waiting to see, if it was going to get warm and these plants were going to grow more. But you can see, so these are some sedges that are planted really close together. There's still a lot of like growth from last year, which is like the brown stuff, but I actually dig those out and plant them in other places in the yard. And then in the back, we have some sedges and other short native wildflowers. So this is like a Jacob's ladder that hasn't bloomed yet. This is not my yard, but this is an inspiration picture that I have. This is from Prairie Moon Nursery, and when I saw this, so remember I told you about pussy toes? This is a path made of pussy toes. And then these are, like on the side, prairie drop seeds, and then on the further out, there's like liatris and some other tall grasses. So there's blazing star and other native grasses out there. So remember I said to start small and be patient. So this is our attempt at doing that. It's really small now. We just planted this last year. But we have the pussy toads along the middle, and they're starting to grow, and then sedges along the edge, and then some taller native grasses that haven't started growing yet because they're warm season grasses. They grow later on in the summer. Sedges are kind of cool season grasses, so many of them grow earlier in the year. So hopefully in a few years, we'll get a little closer to that picture, but for now we are not winning any Skokie gardening awards. I have a few just other pics, so I'll come back to this, but I have a few just other pictures of some native species that we've used in our research that we think are nice. So a lot of these have been mentioned already, but this is Pennsylvania sedge. This is Carex blanda, which is common wood sedge, I believe. It's a little bit thicker of a leaf. This is path rush. I mentioned it. You can use it in paths. This is kind of an example of how some of our species look when it's nice out and then when it's cold out. And so you can see Carex blanda is pretty green even in the dead of winter when a lot of other things are very brown. This is our sedge lawn. This is wild petunia. It's actually in a lot of the illustrations. I haven't talked about it a lot. It's really, really beautiful, but it does spread a lot, which some people like and some people don't like in their lawns, but it's really pretty. Wild strawberry is a beast. It is a native plant. It persisted in Chicago after being herbicided like multiple times, multiple winters, and we stopped planting it because it was a little bit aggressive, but in some cases maybe that's what somebody is looking for. Pussy toes, shout out, I love it, it's so cute. It's got the leaves that are really short and close to the ground and provide nice ground cover, and then for a little bit in the spring, they have the white flower on them. Prairie smoke, again, it's got leaves that persist even in the winter. The flowers don't live as long, but they're really beautiful. Nodding onion is an example of one. All of the native onions, the leaves of it kind of look like grass, and then in the fall, it forms this flower. Jacob's ladder, talked about that. Silky aster, this is good for drier soils. It's really pretty. Butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed. You've probably heard about milkweeds and pollinator support, but we often just think of the common milkweed when there are in fact many, many different species of milkweed, including this beautiful orange one. And then these are some species that we think are beautiful and we want to like, but they haven't established very well for us in our experiment yet. So like this one is called blue-eye grass. It's not a grass, it's in the iris family, but it looks like a grass and then it has those adorable blue flowers. So I think here's another milkweed. And I will end here. This will take you to our website, so will the website, Rethinking Lawns, and you can find the guide, pictures, and information about all of the species that we've used in our experiment. So that is all I have to say, but we have about 10 minutes for questions. Do you want me to call on people you want to call?
Yeah, you go ahead and I'll.
Yeah.
I bought 36 plugs of no-mow lawn.
Here, hold on one second.
I bought, I believe it was 36 plugs of no-mow lawn from Gethsemane in Chicago. And within a week, they were all chewed down. Are these all rabbit proof?
Oh, that's a good question. What was it? Do you know? Was it a sedge?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
It was this tall, and then it was that tall.
Yeah.
Some are coming back, but not very well.
So I would say not all of these are rabbit proof. A lot of them are. I don't know. I have a lot of these species growing in my yard. Again, I think the thing is trying to establish the roots early on. Using chicken wire if you need to do that. People do that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good resource for which ones are rabbit proof, but it's probably out there somewhere.
Hold on one second.
Hi, I just moved to Skokie last summer. The first thing I did was get in the garden. But, they traditionally have those basic grass fronts with the overgrown yews in the window. I took out probably 2/3 of the front yard, but I used cardboard and then soil mulch, and I planted into it. What are your thoughts on cardboard and saving the grass?
Yeah, that is a good question. So we get asked that question a lot for when we say that we use herbicide to kill the grass versus cardboard to solarize the grass, where you're still killing the grass, but you're not using herbicides on it because you're just preventing it from getting the sun. So my collaborator who does soil ecology says that if you solarize, you are killing potentially the soil organisms too, in addition to the plants, whereas if you do herbicide, you're just killing everything above ground, but not killing the soil organisms. So I think that there's pluses and minuses to both of the approaches.
Okay.
Hello. The Jackson Park lawn looked really cool. Like, do they ever mow that, or does it just grow to a certain height and it just looks great?
Yeah, I think they don't. The pen sedge will grow to I think 8 to 10 inches and just stop and sort of flop over. It can be mowed. They have some wildflowers dappled in would be the landscape design term. But yeah, it looks really good and it has persisted for, I think, 8 years. So, yeah.
Here's a question.
Hi there. When you were talking about the sedge grass and rush combo, so the Pennsylvania was native. Were the other two, the purple lovegrass and pathrush, are those native?
Yeah,
also?
those are all native.
And then for just grasses in general, are any of them good in shade, or is it all sun?
Yeah, so a lot of the sedges are good in shade because a lot of the ones that come from the woodland understory are going to be good in shade. So that is a thing that could be used, thinking about what sedges are grown in shade, and then they can be kind of near the ring of a tree. And then the eco-grass fescue, one of their things is that it does really well in shade too. So that's non-native, that's the fine fescue stuff.
Hi, I'm surprised you didn't mention, we have a lot of ground ivy with little purple flowers and fig buttercups. Are those, I don't even know how we got them.
I don't know. We haven't used those. We haven't used those ground covers. So I don't know about them. I'm sorry.
All right, let me scoot over here. Got a hand raised over there. Pass that over to this man.
Thank you. Becky, thank you. Skokie Public Library, thank you. Everyone here, thank you for supporting biodiversity and pollinators. Question. Parkways, I didn't know we could plant on there, and you mentioned 6 inches tall, 6 inches from the sidewalk or something like that. Could you just quickly cover that?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that, Rachel?
Bob Quinn, where are you?
I was I do not represent the village, so I don't want to tell you something wrong.
There is a village thing. It's 6 inches. And if you go online on the village code, it would be there. So basically, it's for safety. You don't want to grow the tall plants on the parkway, but there are many, many, many choices for low plants. And I can assure you that many people who have done this are not having any problem finding the proper plants for those areas. 6 inches from the sidewalk, yeah. I think because my neighbor has that, and you saw his lawn border, and that is accurate.
Yeah, the idea is not to have anything drooping over the curb or drooping over the sidewalk, and the sight lines are real important. The question is about grass, because there's lots of grasses, right? And some of the grasses you mentioned are going to be more than 6 inches. Mm-hmm. And they don't, to my knowledge, don't fall under the code. The grasses are really talking about is your typical lawn grass and not other native grasses.
You're not going to, okay, go ahead.
So when we stopped using herbicides, having herbicides put on our lawn, then Creeping Charlie took over. So transformed 2/3 of our backyard into native plants, used the cardboard method and mulch, right? But the rest of it that's grass is in terrible shape. We have an 18-month-old granddaughter. Will the fine Fescue, thank you. Will that stand up to toddlers running around on it? And will that also help sort of, make the creeping Charlie not continue, stop creeping? That's a good description. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yes, the eco-grass fescue is supposed to stand up to dogs and children. And it grows really densely, so I think it could be competitive with creeping Charlie, but that may be an instance in which you want to use herbicide on it first before you're putting down the fescue. And then, there are herbicides that are broadleaf herbicides, so they would just be attacking the creeping Charlie, but they wouldn't be killing the grass. So that could be something else to think about.
If there's an area that's prone to flooding and it's paved, and you have the power to rip out the pavement, would you recommend trees or grasses with long roots?
That's a good question. I don't know one versus the other. I know that if you have the native plants, the grasses and wildflowers would grow faster than a tree would, depending on what size it is when you get it. That's a good question. I don't know comparatively. I would like to look into that. But I know rain gardens do have a lot of grasses and wildflowers in them, kind of ones that would persist in wet areas.
So if I could, I have two questions.
Yeah.
First one is, it's not actually grasses, but of course, Skokie has a lot of vacated alleys where the lots are graded with drainage toward the back where the water doesn't go anywhere. It's basically, ideally a wetland, and you'd love to get the water into the ground. So do you have any recommendations for that?
Same, I would look into plants that are used in rain gardens or like wetland plants. It may be obvious from this talk, but I really study prairies, which are drier and more upland species. So I would look into resources. I think there are some on the Skokie Sustainable Gardening website about rain gardens specifically.
And thank you. And second question, if I have an area that was killed by mistake and...
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no judgment.
It wasn't me, but it's... anyway, and so now, of course, the dandelions and things took over. How can I plant something sustainable there where before the invasives take over again?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends, I guess, if you're trying to get rid of stuff before you plant things. But I think it's important to think about not having open soil. So thinking about mulch and wood chips, like when you're putting those natives in, even around the area, around where you put each of the native plants in, put some mulch or wood chips or whatever kind of mulch. And then it's a good plan to try and know what you planted so that you can weed out the things that you didn't plant. And that sounds really obvious, but you can put little signs or just take photos of where you put the stuff. So you're like, okay, this is what I planted. And then you can tell if something is not something that you planted and if you can get rid of it in the early stages. I don't know if that's helpful.
Let's see, a few more questions. Who haven't asked a question? He asked a question. Oh. The woman, she didn't raise her hand again, though, so I don't know. You raised it? Okay, yeah. I missed her last time. All right. 2 more questions, okay?
If we plant these sedges, et cetera, and any of these things, do you have to water them intensely then when you start?
So you would
I'm
water
trying to get
these,
away from watering.
You would get away from watering eventually. So the idea is if you're planting native species, to water them a lot for the first 3 to 4 weeks. So even every other day for the first 3 weeks. And then you really shouldn't have to water them very much unless it's very dry. So that 3 weeks of intense watering, and then you should be able to dial it back. If we're in a drought, you can water once a week, but ultimately the idea is you shouldn't have to water at all, and the native plants will be using just the water from rain.
Yes. I attempted last year to have, the last couple of years, to have a pollinator little garden in my area. But then I attracted a lot of yellow jackets and bees, which bees is okay, but yellow jackets. And then when we wanted to have some meal in the backyard, all came to the meals, they were there. Is that normal? I mean, I'm afraid that I'm gonna get attacked.
Do you know? Well, so I think probably yellow jackets may be more attracted to like food and drinks and sugar and things like that than to the plants. Generally, we think of pollinator plantings as supporting native pollinators, which most of those are not stinging insects. But I know that it can be so it shouldn't. Again, I'm not a bee person, I'm a plant person. But I think the thing to think about, and I really was surprised nobody asked me about rats. I was ready for the rat question, so the yellow jacket question I didn't think about as much. But I think we can think about the plants, and we can think about our own food and our own garbage and do as much as we can about that to prevent attracting yellow jackets. The rat answer.
What's the rat answer?
So I set it up. The rat answer is, I talked to people from the Lincoln Park Zoo earlier this week who are studying community gardens and rats. And so they took this thing called Rat Academy, which is put on by one of the city organizations in New York. They make a rat academy to teach you how to not get rats. And so one of the things they said in terms of plants was, well, they really said that it's more the garbage and it's more the food that attract rats and not the plant cover. I think people think when their plants are really short, the rats are going to have nowhere to hide, right? But so keeping the garbage and the plants separate from one another, so there's not a good path between both of those things. The other thing that they said is you may want to think about plants that go upward and aren't as spreading wide, so that there's like areas underneath for potential rats to run through. So you can think about putting space in between the plants, again, with like mulch. They also told me that if you can look around for like a den, and if you see it, you're supposed to collapse it with your foot, which seems kind of mean, but I guess that's one of the things that you can do. But in my experience, and I have a lot of native plants, and it's the fruit trees that I had that were dropping tons of fruit on the ground that was bringing the creatures to my yard, and not the native plants.
All right, well, thank you, Becky. What a great talk.
Thank you, everyone.
Very inspirational, and we hope to see you at other talks, and sign up for our email newsletter or our news, we'll promote our events on this sheet out there, and thank you for coming.
I also did want to say that I have some versions
up here
of
there's
this.
about 20 of these.
Yeah, I have some of these guides, and you can get them online from our website if you